Hello and welcome to this week's video, My Hero Academia. Now, because there is no new episode this week, I decided instead to check out the first episode from the Memories mini-series to see if there was anything worth talking about, and, well, it turns out there is, so let's get into the review itself and stick off as we always do with these reviews by talking about the positives. This features some new and interesting material. The choice of old material is very well selected for what it is, and it all makes for a fine addition to the wider story, even if the timeline placement of this is a little bit weird for reasons sort of to discuss shortly. So many of you will be wondering why I'm doing a review of what is largely Eclipse Show episode, and well, outside the honest desperation for material as yet again we're losing an episode due to the Olympics, it turns out that this special episode thing isn't just old stuff. There is some new material here, new material that I honestly do think is worth talking about. Now, just one little thing, well, two little things before I go too far into the review. Still in the tail end of a heat wave, got the window open to view any weird noises, that's where it's coming from, and I am still coming off from being ill, so if I don't sound all that well or all that on it, you know what the problem's going to be. But anyway, with that said, to actually get back into talk about the review itself, for those that don't know, this mini-series was released ahead of this year's series to act as something of a refresher for audiences, to gear them up for the oncoming series and to refresh their memory on some things that have been coming in the previous handful of series, which itself is not a bad idea given that we're getting into the final storyline of all of this, which, you know, again, fair enough, good for doing it. They're playing off all the TV series and doing something like this. However, there's one slight flaw with this. Well, two, and I'm not going to discuss them in the negatives because, well, maybe I will, but we'll get onto that shortly. But anyway, the two small flaws is that there is, of this runtime of this episode at least, a good quarter of it is made up of new material. The second issue is the fact that this episode takes place about midway through this current season. In between episode 4 and episode 5, it takes place the night before the big battle of All For One is about to begin, so putting it out ahead of this year's season just feels really odd. There are no major spoilers in it, it has to be said, but it is one of those things where there's a few visual images which we now know the context of, so having it come out before the season feels a little bit odd, but still, I will have to say is that to actually get into talking about the episode itself, I find the new material that we have here to be genuinely fascinating. It gives us a great insight into the mental state of Midoriya ahead of this big final battle. I will admit that this isn't quite the framing device I thought it would be. That it would be essentially a case of him going, there'd be a little bit towards the start of the episode that's original, then he'd reflect upon past adventures with maybe a little bit of commentary, and then at the end of the episode you'd have a little bit more of him to act as a framing device. That isn't what we end up getting here. Yes, there are moments where it periodically cuts back to him looking stoic and serious and heroic, but for the most part, I have to say is that, yeah, I'm shocked at just how much new material it is for him at the start of this episode, just how much it ends up going into the mental state that he's in. I will admit that this is not the deep dive into his character and where he is at this moment in his life that the title of this episode, both the translated into English title and the Japanese title, would lead you to believe, because there's a large section of this episode which ends up focusing on Tomura, but we'll discuss that shortly. I find the contrast between what we see in this early quarter of the episode with the new material with him, and then the contrast between that and where we end up seeing him in the flashbacks, to be rather interesting. It's a good way to show just how much he has grown and matured over the 12 to 18 months that this story has taken place over, but still underlining the fact that he's more irrational moments, particularly when we started to get into the Dark Deku stuff, that it didn't come totally out of nowhere. That it shows that how his mental state has evolved, that still he's making the same kind of irrational decisions that a boy that his age would end up making, and that I genuinely do appreciate that, because I feel that with a lot of TV series, especially when it comes to the anime and manga that I've seen and read, that it seems to forget that when you have it seems to forget the age of the protagonist when it comes into their comprehension and their understanding of the world around them, that they aren't mature enough to make these kind of decisions, and then they end up doing so. And Midoriya is shown at times to be irrational and overly emotional, which makes sense because of the age that he is, and showing us the clips that we end up seeing of him in the past, and then we can make that parallel up to the Dark Deku stuff. Again, it ends up underlining the fact that whilst he is growing and maturing, he still hasn't grown and matured to the point where you could say that he's a fully developed human being. And I do like the new stuff that we end up getting with him. It's very narrow, it has to be said, is that I did appreciate the fact that we ended up seeing this stuff, and again, it is one of those things that it did kind of bend my head a little bit, that we're getting so much new material for what's supposed to be a clip show. It's in this episode that we get a better understanding of the origins of All for One and One for All. We've had hints and flashbacks to the history between those characters and that power many times in the past as well. It's been stuff that's hinted at, and it's stuff that we see again in flashback sequences of when Midoriya is in that thought space realm that he was in about a season or two ago, and I like that. I think that it is interesting to see how it ends up going with it. And again, this is new material, unless I'm mistaken. This is stuff that hasn't been in the series up until this moment. Maybe in the manga, but it's certainly not been in the TV show as far as I'm aware. We see, once again, All For One talking about he took inspiration from villains in comic books to be his guiding light, being a thing that matured him and made him the man that he is today, or the man that he was in the past, and how it ended up inspiring him to become a villain for reasons which we discussed last week. So this ends up creating this weird serendipity that last week he outright says, yeah, I took my inspiration from comic books, to then have it underlined this week, but it's only underlined this week because we don't have material this week, and I just find that really a weird coincidence. But again, I do like that. I like that, well, it's an interesting dynamic to the character that part of his origins, the thing that made him become a villain, is him drawing inspiration from superhero fiction. And rather than him reading these stories and thinking, I'm going to become the hero, I'm going to become the figure of inspiration, I'm going to become the symbol of peace, instead he decided to become a monster, a villain he wanted to control rather than to be controlled, as a hero of this world would end up being so. I'm sure that we'll end up learning more of him in due course. We might even see over the next few episodes of these. I will just say here and now, I'm not planning to do any further reviews on these episodes. I'll only do it if there's another break at some point over the remainder of this season, and I might do a bonus video where I just discuss all of them in one video towards the end of this season, but we'll soon see where all that ends up going. Something I did enjoy seeing within this episode is getting a very clear and unabashed understanding of just how much Tomura hated Stain. Like, I don't recall that stuff being in the original run. I am certain that it was stuff that was hinted at, that he wasn't particularly keen on him, but in this sequence of events, in these flashbacks that we end up getting, it just underlines him that, my God, he really just hates that guy's guts and what he is. I will admit, it's weird getting these flashbacks and this stuff from him in this flashback sequence, because how the hell Midoriya would have known about all of this stuff, I don't know. But hell, you could say that about a lot of the different point of view stuff that we end up getting from him. But hey, maybe he asks around after the fact, after everything is done and dusted. But still, I do like what we end up getting up to see here. I do think the character does get like a dedicated episode in this mini-series to go into their backstory a little bit more, so it will be interesting to see that, bearing in mind it seems to be that there's going to be some new material sprinkled in here and then. Again, I think that it is just a great look to see just how much these two characters really hated one another. Look, we all know full well again of Stain's war against anyone who isn't up to his warped standards. And thanks for reading Vigilantes, we understand those standards a little bit better. So it makes sense he'd really hate Tomura, if nothing due to the fact that he's a villain. And you think that Tomura would just resent Stain because, well, he just resents him. But no, he hates him. He doesn't resent him because he's stealing the spotlight or because he's tangentially, from a certain point of view, some kind of vigilante hero. No, he hates him, and he hates him for what he represents. That he represents the inspiration of All Might, and that All Might represents the status quo of the hero world, a status quo that never saved him. It's not just a jealousy thing between two villainous characters. It's because of what that villain, that vigilante character represented, because it represents a legacy of a hero that represents a world that never saved him. And the truth of the matter is, I find that to be a fascinating dynamic. In the main series, we know how much Tomura just wants to tear everything down, any semblance of that old world, even if it will end up inevitably extended to people who aren't even remotely heroes, but they themselves may have been in some way inspired by heroes. And I find that to be an interesting dynamic with that. Beyond this, it's hard to talk about clip shows because at the end of the day, you're just talking about old material, and if I was to talk about old material, I'd rather do it as reviews of those particular episodes and those particular storylines and just going, oh wow, look at the animation in that fight sequence against the Muscular. I think there may have been a few new shots in there, but if there isn't, then, well, it's just a chance to see what a great fight that was again. I liked seeing that stuff again, and I am happy that at the end of the day, it turns out that this wasn't just a clip show. And the clips that they did end up using worked in a way that it meant it felt a little bit more like we were watching a real episode. That it didn't just feel like a clip show episode. That everything was strung together in such a way in which you could be fooled into thinking that it is a legitimate episode and that it is just all new material. It's obvious that it isn't. It's obvious given the presentation of it all that it isn't, but I think that it does do a lot more than one would expect it to. But still, with all that said, let's get into the negatives. And I have to say that, and this is going to sound like the strangest negative I've done in a very long time, but I think my big problem with this episode is the fact it was too good given the brief. Like, this is really just supposed to be a clip show episode, part of a clip show miniseries that's designed to refresh audiences for what's coming in the upcoming season. And that's all it needed to be. Maybe with a little bit of original material here and there to make the framing device, as I gave an example of towards the start of the episode. We've all seen episodes like this in other TV programs, whether they be superhero, whether they be science fiction, whatever they may be. There's plenty enough in comedy circles as well. You'd have a situation where our characters, for whatever reason, can't do the usual thing, maybe for real-world reasons, maybe for in-universe reasons, so they reflect upon things that happened in the past. Oh, remember that time when such and such happened? And then we go into that stuff, and then maybe that's all we'd end up getting is clip show stuff. Then at the end of the episode, oh boy, what a raucous set of adventures we had. Hum-de-hum-de-hum, cue, end credits, and ending gag. This episode goes above and beyond and ends up giving us something which is honestly rather interesting. Again, the way that it uses its clips from the previous seasons is good because it does give us... It helps to underline a lot of the stuff that we're learning, as well as helps to give the new material something else to hang its coat on. However, with all of that said, it does feel very bloody weird to me that a clip show episode like this can exist, because there is at least a good quarter of the runtime of this episode which is new material. New material which... that whilst it isn't essential, you're not poorer for having not seen this, but it is stuff that does add flavour and does help to add context into some of the stuff we're seeing over the past few weeks, and does to a certain regard recontextualise some of the stuff that we've seen in the past and some of the clips shown in this episode. Again, not radically, it's not changing the point of view of us in any regard, but it's still something that it feels like a case of, okay, shouldn't this have been an episode? Isn't this material that should have been in an episode? It's almost in some areas like the Save Rescue Training OVA, which I always go back on as far as special episode OVA things that should have been a mainline episode, because it's the episode which teases Endeavour and Shoto's very estranged relationship. And given just how important that is to those characters, the fact it was just stuck on an OVA which was only released as part of a comic book convention and has never been made freely available to general audiences is something that bends my head. Because if it really was just a knockabout adventure thing with All Might pretending to be a villain, I could be forgiving it. But that OVA, again, has fascinating character development stuff which should have been in the mainline series for what it would end up setting up later on. In this, we get something similar. Again, not quite to the same extent of it, but we are getting insights into the mental state of our characters. We're getting understanding as to who they are deep down and how they see their contemporaries, both in terms of heroes and in terms of villains. We get an understanding of the origin of evil, so to speak, of All For One, and they get better understanding as to how he became the way that he is. We're not quite through the looking glass on that, but all the same, to have these little teasers and bits of information as part of a mini-series that I dare say a lot of people aren't going to see, because, like myself, they'll have looked at this and gone, oh, this is just a clip show thing? You know what, I'll skip that, I don't need the clip show stuff. I think it's a little bit silly. Now, with that said, it isn't the biggest negative in the world, because, again, if I'm criticising it for being too good, given what it is, you know, it's not the worst thing in the world, and it is a case of that. Well, I suppose the other negative, as I've teased in the past, is the fact that this episode, at the very least, takes place midway through this season. It takes place between episode 4 and episode 5, but whilst there isn't anything within it which is a major spoiler for anything that came immediately before or immediately thereafter, it does feel strange to me that, again, for a clip show, we are getting stuff this far into this coming series. It just feels really weird to me. And that's why it ends up becoming a hard... Actually, let's pivot into the overview just before I get into my wrap-up thing. I think that this is a fine episode with some really great details that, as fascinating as they are, I can't say you're any poorer of having not watched this one. It's great additional stuff. It's great flavour. It's like... I don't know a good analogy. I suppose it would be in a certain case like you got a history exam and then you read like the diary of a famous historical figure. And whilst that extra information is not going to help you pass your grade, it does help you understand the circumstances of the history that you're studying. Like, this is that similar kind of thing. Watching this episode does not radically change your understanding of this universe or these characters or how they got to where they are, but it does make you go, okay, so this is how these things work, and that's perfectly fine. It's good in and of itself. But the fact that this is for a mini-series that released before this series, which takes place midway through this series and has some very, very, very minor spoilers for what was coming up, it's honestly kind of wild to me. And that's something I'm just going to be baffled by more than anything else. Like, I do have a theory as to why this mini-series exists, and I might explain that in a future video, whether it be... Well, it will be when I eventually do the big, like, review of this mini-series stuff, because, I don't know, there's something about this that just feels really weird to me, that you'd have these flashback episodes before the main series, even though they take place during the mid-series. Like, it just feels really weird to me in a way that I'm struggling to comprehend. Again, no major spoilers within it, but still, with that said, like... Seriously, if you didn't know what was coming in this year's series, you'd be kind of shocked. Like, they pretty much outright say that, yeah, we're going into the final battle this season. So if you didn't know that going into this, yeah, it's really odd. Really, really strange. I know that in Japan they have very different attitudes towards spoilers and such, but yeah, this just feels odd. There feels like there's something else here, which... Maybe I'll discuss it when I end up doing my big review of this miniseries. If I do, it'll be a bonus video towards the end of this year's review schedule. Now, there's not going to be a comment corner this week because, like I say, this is an episode that takes place before this year's series. And if anyone's happening upon this, they're going through this chronologically, I don't want to give any spoilers away for stuff that's coming down the pipeline, even though I think I've already just done that, so I apologise, but hey, we're getting into the final few series and a half, so we'll soon see where all that goes. But anyway, thank you all for watching. Let me know what you thought about this one. I will be doing a comment in the next video. Hopefully there are no more breaks in the recording schedule coming up, but we'll soon see. But hey, at least for now we have a reliable source of alternate content. But anyway, thank you all for watching, thank you all for listening, and see you next time. Goodbye! Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, favourite, subscribe, click the bell, and do all the YouTubey stuff that YouTube wants you to do. Go on, it'll do me a power of good. Until next time, my friends, goodbye!